So today we're going to talk about, and it's kind of a layered situation. We're going to talk about using the financing contingency and or not using the appraisal contingency with the financing or without it. So in this kind of a market where offers are still very competitive and you're still trying to incentivize a seller to choose your offer over others, this is where this problem came up, because adding another contingency, any other contingency in an offer is going to be not as attractive to a seller as a cleaner offer would be. But if your buyer and your buyer's agent is concerned that they're going to buy a property that does not appraise, or they're afraid they're going to spend too much on a property, or say they have a very big down payment and they're not sure how it's going to be, how the appraisal will be treated by the bank. These are different considerations to talk about, and that's what we'll talk about today. And I'm using, the only thing I'm using today instead of slides is this article, short article, from one of the WRA magazines in October of 2020 called Pick Me. I didn't include an appraisal contingency, meaning my offer is cleaner because I don't have an appraisal in there. So I like this article. I think it was very clear. It talks about using the appraisal with the financing or not using the appraisal contingency, and what risk do your buyers have under these situations. So the opening paragraph talks about the competition among buyers interested in the same property. One trend emergency is buyers are not including the appraisal in contingency to induce the seller to select that offer. So what risk does that pose for your buyer? This is what you need to know, and this is what your buyer needs to know going into it. Your duty is to educate your client more than anything else. It is your client's decision on what to do, but they can only make a decision if they are educated and they have the full picture from you, their agent, from you, their buyer's agent. So I wouldn't just say, do you want an appraisal contingency or not? You should know what the distinction is and how to make this distinction to your buyer to make an educated choice and not just grabbing one or not. The apparent appeal for a seller to choose an offer without an appraisal is that if the buyer offered over list price and the competition resulted in buyers outbidding each other up to a purchase price that will not be supported by an appraisal, by the lender's appraisal, the buyer will not be able to get out of the offer. If indeed the lender's appraisal is less than the agreed upon purchase price. This is where I want to make the point. Sometimes that may be true, sometimes. Other times, what this means is the lender ultimately issues a rejection letter or offers financing on terms other than those included in the financing contingency. So the key is if you have to have a financing contingency, what are the distinctions between adding an appraisal contingency or not? So they start in this article talking about the history of the appraisal contingency, and that was a lot of what I was helping agents in my offices know what this was about. And at that time, we used an appraisal contingency really only for a cash offer or for a large down payment. So if they were putting 20% down or more, or it was cash, it was common sense that they would also want an appraisal contingency just to assure them that they weren't buying something for far more than it was really worth. But now this has really changed because some of the lenders in a financing contingency will not, what am I trying to say? They will not deny financing based on a low appraisal because the appraisal may not be based, the appraisal may not be based on the purchase price, but maybe just appraised on the loan amount. So let's go down to this part where it says the 2010 WB11 residential offer to purchase first saw the appraisal contingency. At that time, one of the reasons for adding the appraisal contingency was to address how lenders were issuing loan commitments. And that's just what I said. Many lenders followed the practice of issuing a loan commitment subject to an appraisal. The buyer would deliver the loan commitment according to the terms of the offer to purchase, satisfying what was then known as the financing contingency. Note today, it's not called the financing contingency, it's called the financing commitment contingency. So subsequent to issuing a loan commitment, the lender would have the property appraised. If the property did not appraise at or above the purchase price, the lender would choose not to make the loan. The buyer would have a very likely end up on a breach of contract because the buyer could not close on a transaction when all the contingencies had been satisfied. So the primary reason to include an appraisal contingency in the offer to purchase was to protect the buyer from becoming contractually obligated to purchase a price that does not appraise or above the purchase price. The lender will not make the, as a result, the lender would not make the loan. If the buyer uses a separate appraisal contingency and receives a loan commitment subject to an appraisal, the separate appraisal contingency is not waived by delivering the loan commitment to the seller. If there is no separate appraisal contingency and the buyer delivers a loan commitment that is subject to appraisal, the buyer is assuming the risk that the property will appraise at the required value. And then if the property does not appraise at that value, a buyer without a separate appraisal contingency may end up in breach of contract if the property does not close. If an independent appraisal contingency is used, the buyer is protected and is not in breach of the property if the property does not appraise at the required value, even if the loan commitment subject to the appraisal had previously been submitted to the seller. So in this situation, say the buyer receives a loan commitment saying, we've approved your loan, but is conditioned on the appraisal. And the appraisal comes in low. What the buyer's position at that point was that he does not send the loan commitment over to the seller because that would satisfy the financing contingency. But if the property is conditioned only on getting an appraisal that matches the purchase price, the buyer withholds the loan commitment and see if he can work out a way to either not get the loan and ask the lender then to say, it's not going to appraise. I don't want, the loan, I can't get the loan. Most likely the lender will send a letter of rejection, just saying that they cannot get the loan. It doesn't have to even say that it was because the appraisal was low. It just says in a letter that he cannot make the loan. So with a notice to the seller, not delivering the loan commitment, delivering a notice to the seller and delivering the letter from the lender saying that he can't make the loan, that is enough for the buyer to get out. So he does get an escape if the property did not appraise. So it says the appraisal contingency remained largely the same the next round of revisions, which had the mandatory use in July of 11. The next round of revisions on the residential offer to purchase came in a little over 1 short year after the last revisions. And this goes to show that back-to-back revisions are not totally unheard of. While the appraisal contingency remained largely the same in the first one, it did receive some minor changes to improve its function. The 2010 residential offer to purchase indicated the buyer had to deliver notice objecting to the appraisal with a copy of the appraisal report and seller. The listing party is not a party to the offer, and as such, it did not make sense to require the buyer to deliver the notice and a copy of the appraisal report to the seller and the listing broker. So the next revision in the offer to purchase directs a buyer who is objecting to an appraisal to deliver a notice and a copy of the appraisal report to just the seller or the seller's recipient of delivery, if any, per the delivery terms of the offer. The WB11 residential offer to purchase went unchanged until the very end of 2019, when, after many months of careful and considered suggested improvements, it was time to reveal the new and improved residential offer to purchase, which had a mandatory date of January 1st, 2020. So make sure that you are always using the most current offer to purchase. With this revision, the appraisal contingency included a significant change in that the parties could now negotiate whether the seller would have the right to cure if the appraisal was lower than the agreed upon purchase price. So it gave that right to cure, just like you see the right to cure in an inspection contingency. Now it has kind of a matching contingency for the appraisal. If the appraisal was lower than the agreed upon purchase price, the buyer could give notice objecting to the appraisal and a copy of the appraisal report, and that was it. The offer was null and void. The buyer, of course, did not have the right to deliver a notice objecting to the appraisal, but could have offered the amendment and negotiated a resolution through continued negotiations back and forth between the buyer and the seller. Would the seller come down in price? Can they renegotiate the price? Often in an attempt to negotiate around defects using amendments before the buyer decides to issue notice of defects. By including the optional right to cure, though, the seller now has some leverage even in the initial negotiating process. So it gives the seller a little bit more room so that the buyer is not just banking out because the appraisal was low. So as I just said, much like the right to cure provision in relation to the inspection contingency, a right to cure in relation to the appraisal contingency is often an appealing provision for the seller. So going back to the beginning, saying leaving the appraisal contingency out makes it better for a seller because it's a cleaner offer. A good listing agent can explain to a seller, this is actually a benefit to you because if the appraisal comes in low, we can negotiate. You know, we can decide to change the purchase price or negotiate. So what's happening in this current market? Where there's competition among buyers, it can lead to buyers offering to pay more for a property than what is likely an appraised value will be. If a buyer was concerned about paying more for the property than the appraised value, a buyer would simply include an appraisal contingency, thereby making use of the protection that was original goal of including in the earlier offer to purchase. So when a buyer is competing with other buyers, however, that extra contingency and condition a buyer includes may reduce the chances of that offer being picked because it's not an escape for that buyer. As a result, what listing agents and sellers are seeing is that buyers who are drafting offers without many of the more common contingencies, including even inspection contingencies. So they ask you to complete or consider the following scenario. A seller receives 6 offers, all of which are above list price. for ease of comparison, all the offers include a financing contingency, but 3 offers also include an appraisal contingency. So this is how this scenario can play out. The seller considers the possibility that the property will not appraise at the purchase price or better. So the seller immediately rejects those offers that include an appraisal contingency. For the remaining 3 offers, the terms are all identical except for price. So like any rational person, the seller picks the one with the highest price. The transaction is going to go one of 2 ways, and how it turns out is going to depend entirely on the lender's process for issuing a loan commitment. And this is where the distinction arrives. Option 1. The buyer's lender has a process where the lender will issue a loan commitment subject to the appraisal. The lender issues the loan commitment subject to the appraisal per the terms of the offer to purchase. If the buyer qualifies for the loan, as described in the offer, any loan acceptable to the buyer agrees to deliver to the seller a copy of the written loan commitment. There is even a caution in WB 11 residential offer alerting buyers that the loan commitment may contain conditions. Conditions may include an appraisal, credit check, verification of employment, and others. With a loan commitment in hand, the buyer delivers it accompanied by the buyer's written direction to deliver it to the seller. So he gives his permission to deliver the loan commitment, thereby satisfying the financing contingency. So far, so good. But then the lender orders an appraisal of the property. The appraisal is lower than the agreed upon purchase price. So the lender decides not to make the loan, even though the buyer has satisfied the financing contingency. This buyer whose offer did not include an appraisal contingency is likely going to end up in breach of the contract because the buyer will not be able to close and there are no unsatisfied contingencies that could give the buyer a way out. So the buyer stuck, has to go to closing, even though the loan cannot be delivered to them because the appraisal was low. So option number 2, this lender has a process where the lender will not issue a loan commitment until after the property has been appraised. This is more common, and this is more what we are expecting. The buyer applies for the loan. The appraiser conducts the appraisal. The appraisal is for less than the agreed upon purchase price. And because of the low appraisal, the lender issues a rejection letter or issues a loan commitment, but is significantly different terms than the buyer included in the financing contingency. In either case, the buyer is going to be able to deliver a notice to the seller that financing is unavailable, and therefore financing commitment contingency cannot be satisfied, alleviating the buyer of obligation to go to closing. In short, this buyer gets to get out of the transaction without an appraisal contingency, even though the underlying issue was an appraisal. So this is, I know, sort of controverted and confusing, but the moral of the story is just because the buyer's offer does not include an appraisal contingency does not mean that the buyer will not be able to get out of the transaction when the problem is with the appraisal. It all depends on the lender, whether the lender issues a loan commitment subject to an appraisal, or the lender does the appraisal first and decides whether to issue the loan commitment. In a competitive market, sellers should be cautioned that just because the offer does not include an appraisal contingency, it does not mean that the appraisal will not be an issue. Depending on the lender's process for issuing a loan commitment, the buyer could possibly still get out of the transaction under the financing commitment because the lender gives a rejection letter that the financing is not available. So caution these things to consider if you are a buyer's agent and you're writing an offer, and how do you offer these choices to your buyer. Do I want to put in an appraisal contingency with the financing? Or do I want to write a cleaner offer with just in the financing contingency? The distinction is, and this is a distinction you need to know and a distinction that you need to educate your buyer, is that without an appraisal contingency, if the appraisal comes in low, the lender could deny the loan commitment by saying it's just denied. There's a letter, I cannot give you financing because the appraisal come in low. Actually, he doesn't even have to say why. He can just state that he's not providing a loan commitment and it is denied. With that letter and a notice written by the buyer that this offer is null and void because the appraisal did not meet, they can get out of the contract because of a low appraisal and send over a camera. If the lender is the type of lender that will issue a loan commitment first and then do the appraisal, then it is a risk to your buyer that they may be stuck in a contract that they have to go to closing because they delivered the loan commitment. That's the contingency, but the property did not appraise. I think it's something that you want to talk about with the lender that your buyer chooses. Your buyer needs to understand the distinction of this, but the process is it important to write a cleaner offer with no appraisal contingency, or should I always add the appraisal contingency with the financing? The distinction is the rejection letter from the lender. Well, they issue one. Now, does anybody have questions on this? It's been something we've been tossing back and forth quite a bit. And I like this article. I can put the link to this article in the chat so that if any of you want to keep it and refer to it as a way to educate your buyer in this situation. One horizon look is we may not be having these competitive offers for very long. So the idea would be it's better to protect your buyer with adding the appraisal contingency with financing as we go forward. But in areas where there's still high competition, you don't need to add the appraisal contingency if the lender will do the appraisal prior to issuing a loan commitment. So, any questions, any thoughts about this? Steph, do you have anything you want to add?
Sorry, I'm muted. I think at the end of the day, what I trying to make sure that everyone understands is that it's your buyer's choice. And I feel like a lot of agents are thinking that they need to be making decisions for their buyers, so it's just presenting the information, the possibilities, and letting your buyer choose what to do. So that's my comment, but I hope that Joni is right, and hopefully we're not writing in competition like this for very much longer. I don't know. Obviously, we don't know. So we're just trying to educate you guys on the market of the moment. So
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's a question that's come up a lot with phone calls that I get about should I include an appraisal contingency or not. Obviously, it makes it easier for your buyer to get out of a contract if the appraisal is too low. And it is something that also gives the seller right to cure, so that even though you can still negotiate with the seller, if you don't have an appraisal contingency, you can say, I'll meet you in the middle. I'll put up some money if you come down a little bit, and we'll see if we can get to the the appraisal that came in, but with the appraisal contingency added to your contract, it's already agreed to. The seller is already going to agree to, he will help. He will be given the right to cure. So it doesn't mean that he will cure. It means he's given the opportunity to cure, just like in the inspection contingency. So any other questions? Any questions that you might have? It is pretty complicated, but it's something that I think that we need to understand the contracts and how to write the best contracts for your client. And Steph is so right. It's the buyer's choice. All right.
This is Sarah Furita. I think it's important for us to understand this clearly so we can provide some, if we were asked a question, even though it's the buyer's choice, if they ask us a question, we better be able to understand this. It is pretty complicated. There's a lot to absorb here.
Yeah, I wanted to do this in a team meeting, but I couldn't even figure out how to knock it down to 5 slides on a team meeting.
Well, it's funny you
Because
should say that, because I almost feel like if there was like this Cliff Note version or something that like, here's the bottom line, it's like if and or statements. There's just a lot to, I'm gonna have to go back and just read this again, because there's a lot here.
There is. And I called the legal hotline actually on this too, and I got a written reply from Tracy Rutka, one of the attorneys, and her response is almost totally hard to understand. It's very confusing. And I felt this article laid it out in a clear way. It's still confusing in this article, but I think it's a little bit clearer than Tracy's response was. But it is a complicated situation. I think the bottom line is that you want to know if your lender beforehand, know if the buyer's lender will do an appraisal prior to the loan commitment or issue a loan commitment and then do an appraisal. And for what I've seen, and Steph, you may have seen differently, for what I've seen, most lenders wait for the appraisal to issue the loan commitment.
Right. That's definitely more common.
Exactly. And in that way, then the buyer does have an escape to get out, because he will not approve the loan if the appraisal is low.
I think a lot of things can be answered by talking with a lender directly. In preparing for an offer with your client, or after the buyer consultation stage, and which lender they're going to be working with, reaching out to that lender and asking, okay, so the competitive climate, is this buyer putting enough down that it's possible to get an appraisal waiver altogether? Sometimes I think it's case by case with the property. So it's just really feeling out the buyer situation with the lender directly. And then also asking that question that Joan just brought up, as far as, what is your typical practice? Are you guys waiting to issue loan commitment before you until after you see an appraisal? Are your loan commitments typically conditioned upon appraisal? If not, can we make sure that we're having an appraisal done before loan commitment is issued? And a word of caution too is, as a listing agent, if I receive an offer that doesn't have an appraisal contingency, I might question that right away, and counter back that we would want to see an appraisal gap in there no matter what, So I think come to Joni or I directly. B, ask questions of the lender directly and ask their process, ask the buyer's financial situation as much as they can give, you know, in terms of around how an appraisal would affect their transaction or not, if they have money to bring. I mean, these are questions obviously you're going to be asking of the buyer as well, and all the more important to have a buyer consultation to get those kind of questions answered and out of the way. So it's layered, it's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, we're in this situation because of the competitive offers, and also because the competitive offers are driving the prices higher and higher. I mean, some have just been astronomically over the list price. We're getting more and more appraisal failures. I mean, obviously. So if somebody's willing to spend $80,000 over the list price or $100,000 over the list price, they're going to be pretty certain that the appraised value is not going to match that highly exploded offer to purchase price. So in that case, now, Mr. Buyer, what do you want to do? You know, do you want to, you know, protect yourself with this appraisal contingency? And then the seller might say, well, he's got an out. Maybe I'll choose another offer that doesn't have an out. Or does your buyer say, I'm not sending this offer over until I have that appraisal contingency in there, just to make sure. So it's a choice. It's a difficult choice right now. And as I said, maybe this competitive offer season may be winding down a little bit with the rates going up and some of the fever taken off of the seller's market that we have here. But it's always something to be considering if you're writing offers, if you're a good buyer's agent. And as Steph said, always give Steph or me a call if you've got a certain situation and you're not sure. So we're more than happy to help. So Steph did put the link to the article that I have up here, so you can keep it and kind of ponder it, or you can show it to your buyer. But it is, it's a good article, and it does give all the different aspects of this situation. So if there are no more questions or comments, we can beg off.
I don't think we have, is next week Labor Day?
Yes,
All right.
Memorial Day.
Memorial Day, excuse me. All right, so then the next time that we will be meeting is June 6th.
Yeah.
So have a good Memorial Day, everybody.
Thank you for hanging in there today.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.